So today I want to talk about comprehensible input and natural language learning methods. This is a question that has been arising in recent years as Latin teachers consider whether it would be better to teach their students to move away from the old grammar-based approach that is probably what most people are familiar with, where you're studying charts and declensions and that sort of a thing, into an approach that more closely mimics how children learn language. And I wanted to weigh in on this question because as an instructor of Latin, this is something that I think about a lot, but also as someone who has had a lot of interaction with both ways of learning. When I studied in Rome, I was in a context where I was asked to speak and listen to Latin spoken, and it was really important for my development as a Latinist, as I'll talk about a little bit later. So I kind of wanted to say what the terrain around these questions looks like from my perspective. So first of all, then, what is comprehensible input? Comprehensible input is a way of presenting information to a listener such that they can understand it, even if they don't understand all the details that go into the utterance itself or all the words that make up the statement. Applied to Latin, it usually means doing something that would come under the heading of natural language learning, where you're trying to pick up language in a natural way. So rather than saying, here's a list of vocabulary words, memorize these vocabulary words by staring at them or by making flashcards or whatever else, which is all very unnatural. There's nothing natural about that. Instead, you would say something like, hold up your hand and say, manus, manus, una manus, duo manus. And so you've gotten, manus means hand, manus is feminine because I said una, and the manus is fourth declension because the plural of manus is manus with a long U. And so you pick up those things as it were just naturally, just in the context of conversation. You're not thinking about, you don't think manus means hand, you think manus means this thing right here. And so the idea is that you're avoiding that translation to English and all this sort of thing. So that would be the foundation of such an approach. And there's a really good argument that is often brought out in favor of teaching Latin this way, and that is that this is how children learn. Children are children are often held up as being the examples of, oh, it is so great to be able to learn language the way children learn it because it's so easy for them and all this sort of thing. And so natural language learning is meant to do this exactly that way. Children don't take special classes, and yet they often come out better than fluent because they come out as native speakers, which is even better than fluency. Their brains are more flexible, neurologically speaking. They're creating neurons all the time and all this other sort of thing. They haven't settled down into boring adult, rigid ways of thinking, and so they can more easily pick up all the exceptions and all the various little things that go into language. And they're hardwired for language learning. They have this special ability to learn language that adults don't have. The way this is usually talked about, all of those advantages that children have do go away at some point, and at some point fairly early on. So that if you're in a position to ask yourself, do I want to learn another language, then you've already lost all of those things that a child has, because you lose all that at a very young age. So because all that is held to be true, then it's felt that, well, children are the best learners of language, and even though we don't have those advantages, if we imitate the way children learn, it will be a more natural and more successful way of learning language. This is, in fact, the best case scenario of language learning because children do it better than anyone else does. But I think it's worth questioning every aspect of that account. The neurological grounding for this claim that children's brains are more plastic because they're able to make new neurons and adults don't have that capability, that's been called into question. That was accepted neurological dogma for a very long period of time, but as I understand it, neurology as a field has moved away from that and has instead moved to a position that says that our brains keep making neurons our entire lives. Maybe the reason it seemed to us before they didn't make new neurons is because most adults do the same things over and over again, and brains make neurons where you're spending the energy. So if you're playing piano, your brain's going to be making new neurons and keeping those pathways strong, whereas if you stop playing piano, those pathways are going to not be maintained and they're going to slowly decay over time as neurons die and new neurons aren't made to replace them. So this means that the adult brain is a lot more plastic than we originally thought. Where you spend your time is where your brain is going to grow in its flexibility, and you can, in fact, encourage it to be more flexible in various ways. The other thing is that it doesn't seem that children are hardwired for language. They don't seem to have any special language learning capacity over and above adults. And one of the reasons for that can be seen quite this way. It doesn't. If you think about, for example, I'll take my children as an example. My children are 3 and 5 years old, turning 4 and 6 in the next couple of months. And they're doing very well for their age in terms of both grammar and vocabulary. Other adults are constantly amazed at the things that they do and say, and I'm amazed at the things they do and say and whatnot. They're not in any way behind. They're in fact quite ahead of where it seems like children in their stage, where you would expect them to be in terms of language ability. And I gotta say this, they spend a lot of time working on language. I mean, a ton. I don't think it's no longer true that they spend most of their time working on language, but I would say that there was a period of time of probably 2 years for each of them when the main thing they were doing was trying to understand English. And they would do this for 9-10 hours a day. If they were awake, they were working at what are words for these things? How do I say this thing, right? Taking correction and trying to assimilate those corrections into their system. If I spent as much time on any language as my kids have spent on English, I would be way better than they are now. And I can say this quite confidently because I have learned 11 languages and I can compare my experiences to their experiences. I would get to a place where they are currently. I would get there after 2 years of 2 hours a day learning a language. If I put the time into it, they put into it, I would be way better. So the reality is, kids aren't better at learning languages. They just spend more time doing it. They have more leisure to spend on doing it, and they devote that time to it. They don't get tired of working on it in the same way that adults get tired of working on it. So then let's go back to the question of natural language learning. Is it a better way to learn a language? And I think that greatly depends on your goal. If your goal is to speak Latin well, then natural language learning is going to be the better method. I think that's hands down true. I learned French by living in France. I lived with a French family. I studied at a program at a French university that was a French-only immersion program. There were foreigners from all over the world in my class. There was no common language in the classroom except French. It really was the only language that everyone shared. And while I was there, I made a commitment that I wasn't going to speak English. And so I didn't speak English for the 2-month period, except for 20 minutes once a week when I would call my mom because she didn't speak French. And French is the only foreign language I learned by immersion. And I speak it better than I speak any of my other languages. And that's to be expected from that scenario that's set up. So that's one goal, to speak the language, to speak Latin as well as possible. Natural language learning is the way to go. But what if your goal isn't that? What if your goal is to read the Latin great texts, right? Whether you're talking about classical, medieval, or Renaissance great texts, you want to read Cicero, you want to read Augustine, you want to read Aquinas, you want to read Erasmus, whatever it happens to be. If that's the case, then I think a grammar-based approach is better. And let's go back to that notion of French study, to my experience studying French. In spite of how good I got at speaking French from doing this natural language immersion program, I still had to engage in a special study of grammar in order to be able to read French literature and French philosophy. In fact, even in English, to read Shakespeare, Milton, and Spencer, I had to acquire a more robust and nuanced understanding of English grammar than I had as a native speaker of English. In fact, it's true that to read the best written text in any language, you need at least an implicit understanding of the most complex grammar. To speak or write about these texts, you will need more. You'll need to have concepts and a terminology that's known to others that you can put these concepts into. And so that implicit grammatical knowledge would have to become explicit. And when reading Latin, it's usually the great text of Latin that we want to read. for the most part, I won't say every mediocre text has been weeded out by time, but the things that have made it to us in Latin have been copied over and over again. These are not the bottom of the line. This is the great stuff. Most of the things, if it's on your list and other people have heard of it before, you want to read it, that means it's going to be one of the great texts. It's going to require that more complex grammatical understanding. I would also say that an approach to language that de-emphasizes grammar has this disadvantage to it. It allows you to hide the places where you don't know something or where you don't understand something. I can usually set a passage of Shakespeare in front of students and then read it out to them and say, do you understand what the passage says? And often they'll say yes. And then I'll ask them to explain to me what it says in their own words, and they'll find that they're not able to do so. And then we'll talk through it for 20 or 30 minutes, and at the end of it, they will realize that they didn't actually understand what it meant the first time. Now, I don't think, sometimes it's the case that a student is just saying they understand when they don't. That absolutely happens. But I don't think that's always what's going on. I myself have had the experience of reading a text thinking that I understood it. And then when I really got into it and started asking analytical questions about it, realized that I didn't understand it at all. There was a lot that was going on there that I just never even questioned. I also find this with very basic grammatical things in language. I can ask someone, how is this word functioning in this sentence? And they'll be like, well, I don't know. And then they'll think, wow, it's really weird that I don't know that, right? This type of tacit misunderstanding is, I think, encouraged when we do natural language learning because we focus on the general idea rather than on precision, right? The whole point of comprehensible input is you don't get all the details, you don't get how it works at the particular level, but you still get the gist of it. And whenever we think we're getting the gist of something, we don't know what we're not actually understanding because we're just looking at the larger picture, and we can't be sure the gist we're getting is the right gist. We can only become certain of that from looking at the details that make up that gist, right? Now, there are many checks in a child's environment that mitigate this type of tacit misunderstanding, but the danger is usually principally overcome by specifically grammatical education. And it's why when we send children to school, we make them study grammar even though they're already native speakers of English by the time they come into the grammar classroom. Okay, so if all that's the case, can we conclude that it is better to do natural language learning if you want to speak and better to do a grammar-based approach if you want to learn to read? I don't think it's as simple as that. First, I would argue, and this is implicit in some of the things I've already said, that a natural language approach that disregards grammar would be of little benefit, even for speaking. The student would simply have too many misconceptions, would pick up too many misconceptions without realizing it. They would keep thinking, oh, that means this, or that's done this way. And no, it's not. You saw a couple of instances where it seemed like that was the case, but you were misunderstanding those, and then you codified those into a general principle. We in fact, make grammatical laws for ourselves all the time in the absence of knowing the real ones. And so you'll wind up creating grammatical laws, generalizations, based upon your experience of the language that will be incorrect. Secondly, and this is as important, comprehensible input offers many advantages as a supplement to a grammar-based approach, even if the goal is reading literature. Here's just a couple of them. First of all, comprehensible input brings the ear more fully into play. Languages develop in the ear, and to understand them rightly, you have to follow the sounds rather than the way they look on the page. And when you get into natural language learning, where you're speaking and hearing the language, it allows your ear to be fully engaged in the process of learning that language, which is how it's meant to be. Also, these methods greatly aid in the development of a feel for the language. It's very important, right? That sense that something sounds natural in Latin, that something sounds idiomatic, or that something sounds weird in Latin, that's essential. And that is, in fact, what comprehensible input is aiming at. It develops this much faster than traditional grammar-based approaches. At some point, the student has to stop thinking in terms of translating from Latin into English and just start thinking Latin on its own terms. And that is the number one goal of comprehensible input, to skip the translating language and send you directly into thinking the language in relation to the world, right? To think Latin in relation to the world rather than in relation to English. You have to make the move to that at some point if you're going to be an excellent Latinist, and comprehensible input is a natural way of doing that. Now, this is where I think things are interesting. So if we look back on it historically, originally, grammar-based approaches would progress through composition to recitation of prepared dialogues, where you would do the dialogue with another student, and then from there to colloquia, where you were expected to have conversations with other students or with other scholars in Latin that would prove that you had mastered the language. The fact that our students aren't asked to do that today, they aren't asked to go that far. Most of our students rarely get to composition, much less on into dialogues and colloquia. This is part of what's made the grammar-based approach problematic. It's in its current form and usage, it's incomplete. So when people refer to the grammar-based approach and its limitations in learning Latin, generally what they're referring to is not actually the grammar-based approach, but just the first stages of the grammar-based approach. And there should be no wonder that an incomplete approach yields incomplete results. The modern languages put these two things together. If you're, from the very beginning, if you're studying German, you're going to be spoken to and you're going to be asked to speak in German. I won't say it will be all in German, but from the very first day of class, you're going to be hearing and speaking in German. And at the same time, you're going to be studying grammar. This is the normal method for modern languages. At the same time, my German teacher would always lament the fact that he couldn't teach German in the same way that one teaches an ancient language, with a really rigorous attention to the grammar. And he would always say, someday I'd love to teach a class called German as a Dead Language. So one summer I went to him and I said, hey, if you're going to be around, I'll be around. Can we do it? Can we do German as a dead language? And he agreed, and so we put that course together. We grabbed a really difficult text, and we read it in the same way that one typically would read Cicero or Quintilian in a classics department. And looking back on that experience, I know that I would not have been able to do the work that I did in my dissertation, where I was deeply involved in the German text at a very rigorous level, if I had not had that particular training. If it weren't for German as a dead language, I would have been missing things that I needed to do the work that I did in my dissertation. On the flip side, I learned Latin through a traditional grammar-based approach, but Latin didn't come alive for me until I went and spent the summer studying with Father Foster in Rome. As I listened to him speak, and as he forced me to speak, even more uncomfortably, I began to see a whole new side of the language. I began to really hear its own unique tonality. Latin sounded like Latin. Things sounded Latinly or not Latinly to me as I went through listening to it and speaking it. And yet, of all my language teachers, Father Foster was the one who pressed me hardest on my understanding of grammar. For him, comprehensible input and grammar were not two different things. They were the one task of learning Latin. So I'm not going to conclude that one is better than the other, even with reference to the proximate goal of speaking or of reading texts. Both of these need to be present, and they will be present in the best instruction. However, given that the end game for most Latin learners is reading the great texts, the grammar-based approach ought to take the front seat. So I would recommend a fundamentally grammar-based approach supplemented by comprehensible input for the majority of students. Now, throughout this video, I've been ignoring one really important thing, which is that natural language instruction requires a lot of the teacher. The teacher's got to be able to speak in this language. The teacher's got to have a great deal of, has to him or herself have developed that sense or feel for the language that I talked about in order to communicate that to the students. Whatever we conclude about which is the best way to teach Latin, for many teachers, the grammar-based approach is the only practical one, apart from some targeted professional development that they may or may not have time and money to do. Now, if you're such a one, if you're a teacher for whom natural language learning feels out of reach because of your own history with the language, the advantage of my conclusion here is that I'm not recommending an overhaul of your teaching. Rather, I'm recommending the addition of another angle or facet to your teaching that you can slowly introduce as you develop capacity and expand as you develop capacity. But it doesn't require you to fundamentally rethink what you're doing. It's just to try to fill out what you're already doing. There shouldn't be a war between these two methods, and that's what I really want to communicate here. The idea that I see a lot of folks who are on the CI side saying that grammar-based approaches don't work, and that they turn people off of Latin, and they need to be eliminated and stamped out. And that's excessive. It's untrue. They do work, and it's also excessive, and it also is a bit sawing off the branch that they sit on, as if you can't get rid of grammar, and no one wants to get rid of grammar, and so it's a grammar-based approach needs to form a part of what you're doing at the very least. And then I heard grammar-based folks defending themselves and sort of saying, well, that whole natural language learning thing, it doesn't even work anyway, and they're not very good Latinists and all this other sort of thing. And I don't think it's particularly true either. The point is not to pick one or the other. The point is to find the best instruction. If you teach and can only do one or the other, if because of your training you can only do natural language instruction or you can only do grammar-based instruction, then focus on that and let your students see your passion in that area, right? But I would also recommend that you take time to build the other side as strong as you can. Turn a weakness into a strength so that you'll be able to be a complete Latinist, and also that you'll be able to train complete Latinists. Because like Father Foster, I feel that these two things, the ability to speak, to hear spoken and speak the language, and the ability to do complex grammatical analysis of texts in that language, are just the two parts of learning a language.